I am here with Zach Graumann, who was the former campaign director for the Yang 2020 campaign. You were on the show in the past, but you've been working on lots of things, including a book. So, welcome back, my friend.
Hello, nerds. Tom, I wouldn't have missed it, man. I would not have missed it. It's good to see you again. Your backdrop looks so fancy.
I
Mine kind of
know
looks.
it's.
Mine's upgraded too, I guess. But this is our podcast studio flipped sideways. Anyway, it's good to see you, man.
So, I just actually just finished the book before we started taping.
I
And
can't tell you how much that phrase means to me because you write this thing and you don't know if anyone's gonna read it. So thank you for reading it.
oh, yeah.
You're like one of six at the moment, besides the editors. So thank you.
Well, it
But we're
was my
early, I guess. We're
pleasure.
early.
It was my pleasure. And I also feel like if you're gonna have a guest on the show, wrote a book and read the book.
I do agree with that.
Yeah,
If someone's gonna give you your time, you got to give them that. You got to
yeah.
give them yours back.
And obviously, like the topic was of great interest to me, so it wasn't like, oh,
Yeah,
I
it's
wrote
true.
this book on, medieval like French history or something like that. That might be a little bit tougher. But first of all, congrats! It was a great read. I actually
Thank you.
chuckled a few times. Like you
Good.
definitely are willing to call out kind of the craziness and sort of the audacity and absurdity of even starting the campaign and the journey to decide that you're going to work with this guy and you come into like his mom's apartment
Oh man, I
and
am
it's
not a
yeah.
funny person, generally, but the campaign experience itself was hilarious, and I tried to write it as hilarious as it was, because there were moments where like someone has to be laughing at this, and I can't be because it was my actual life. But writing it down, hindsight, like
Yeah.
absolutely hilarious.
I remembered the description of the seating arrangements, and the one thing was and the rocking a wooden rocking horse.
Yep. So if you read this book, my first day, I'm all like wide-eyed, bushy-tailed, like
Yeah,
that, like first day of the rest of your life type
right.
energy. And Andrew was like, "Hey, we're just gonna like you work out of my mom's apartment for a little bit
Hmm.
in Hell's Kitchen until we, figure out what we're doing the campaign." And I
Hmm.
get there, and the apartment, like, I mean, it's objectively like a piece of shit. Now, I want to be clear: the apartment itself is nice. Like, it's
Right.
a nice home for his mother, and has two floors and that sort of thing.
Hmm.
But for an office, it was awful. Where it was like it had like regular retail Wi-Fi, so like more than one person on there,
Hmm.
pretty disastrous. Like Muhan was living upstairs, and so his shit was everywhere. He had just launched his book, and so he had all these boxes of books, and they were like stacked up like a corn maze, and there's nowhere to sit.
Yeah.
And there was a wooden rocking horse that we found, and Frawley and I, Andrew Frawley, who's our
Hmm.
head of. Man, the early team had so many different titles. He ended up being head of merch. He was like our digital director for Bid,
Hmm.
a big involvement in a lot of our branding. We're both. I'm 6'4", and he's got a couple inches on me.
Right.
So, and this wouldn't. It's like this big, and so we both tried it. It couldn't go for like 10 minutes. Anyway, moments like that, very humbling.
Yeah, I definitely I think the Yang Gang in particular is going to enjoy this book because it definitely feels like you get to like the behind the scenes play by play and you go through the debate prep and
Mm.
the sort of the challenges with the initial debates and the media blackout and all these things and then even talk about the mayoral race. So there's if you are interested in Andrew Yang, I would have to say this is a book to read. It's definitely worth it. So kudos on it, man. How was
Thank
it
you, man.
writing it?
Um, somewhat cathartic. In that you're kind of reliving a lot of this.
Yeah.
Parts of it were very hilarious, like going from our first, like the book opens up with our first, like a detailed description of our first event, which we had
Hmm.
like 15 people at our eventual headquarters in New York. And like a wrinkled Yang 2020
Yeah.
sign. No one showed up. It's awful. We take like a photo to make it look like a bigger crowd. It's terrible. And like we weren't good event planners. We had like Tostitos hint of lime chips like still in the bag. Like, and we had like a roll of paper towels there because we forgot to buy napkins. You have that like visual like description, And then like flash forward to like a 7,000-8,000 person rally we had at MacArthur
Yeah.
Park in LA where there were literal like sparks flying, like there were pyrotechnics going on. And we had just met with Elon Musk and Donald Glover that day. Like it was like, and that happened in like a span of like a year, like 9
Yeah.
months to a year sort of thing. And so it was, so like, you know, I had the emotional journey in writing it, right? Where it was hilarious and fun to write, and that's the point. It's supposed to move. I wanted it to move fast and be fun, but then it's also emotional. Like I kind of take you along for the ride, and there were times where we failed, and it was really hard, and there were times where we succeeded, and that was like even harder emotionally in a way. Is like it's because it feels so good. So, but my big point in the book is that look, we made probably. We made all of the mistakes, probably times 10. Like every mistake you could possibly make running for office, specifically running for president, we made it. We did all of that. But to go from the 15-person, nobody attended event in New York City to 5th in polling, qualifying for 7 debates,
Yeah.
almost 10,000 people at a rally in some of these big cities, we had to be doing something right. And so my point of that was almost like a step back, reflect, like what worked. And I think, we figured out how to run for office in the attention economy. We figured out how to do a different type of branding for politicians that you're seeing all over the place now. But we were one of the first. I think we were the first to do it intentionally, where we said, "This is the world. This is the candidate we're going to create," and it worked. Like the reality is, you could question a lot of decisions I made, and like. I'm probably the first one to tell you that was terrible or a mistake or in hindsight whatever, but you can't argue with the results of man, this man contended for a bit. So it's but to short answer your question, it was it's a lot of work writing a book, especially if you're not a full-time author. But it was a good joint. It was a good journey and fun to do.
You talk about in the book how one could point out lots of things that could have been done differently, but they probably wouldn't have changed the outcome. Do you think there are things that you could have done differently that would have fundamentally changed the probability of the outcome? Like what were some things that actually, well, if I could do it all over again, there were one or two things that might have been kind of, more impactful.
Yeah. I wrote about this too, and you mentioned that. Like, I say this, I can answer this question, but I can really only answer it in hindsight because you don't know what you don't know, and from where we are, there's so much desperation to just you're like screaming for attention and begging for people to pay attention to you and frankly give a shit about what you're doing. So I talk about this in the beginning, or the whole chapter on basically what got you here won't get you there, right? So there were things we did to get Andrew to stand out in the attention economy that eventually hurt him as a contender. And so like the hindsight, we can dive into specifics, but the hindsight, I talk about like the Goldilocks strategy, like the stuff to do that makes him stand out. That's a little gimmicky, but we needed to do stand out. Would have been prepared to pivot to the more serious contender. But the problem was the media only wanted to cover the gimmick fun Andrew Yang and not the serious presidential contender Andrew Yang. So I don't really have a ton of regrets. There's little things, and especially day-to-day personnel stuff. And but high-level strategy, like you don't know. Like in hindsight, like I think there's a few things we could have maybe done better, but we were up. One of the things I wrote in the book is that as much as I, like every one of you listening to this in the Yang Gang, believe we were going to win, we were not going to win the presidency. Like there was just like the amount of odds stacked against that, specifically the powers that be in the establishment in the Democratic Party in particular, to fall in line behind Andrew were pretty Herculean to accomplish. And I mean, they sandbagged Bernie in 2016, right? And he was more popular than we were. Like you could go, like, you could give a bunch of examples here. So that was hard to swallow over time. But again, learned that in hindsight, right? And what I will say is this: I think it's so. I talk a lot about in the book, and many of you live this every day, about something called the attention economy. And it's, what is the attention economy? So right now, it is this. The attention economy is when every day you wake up, and there are billion-dollar corporations and people and industries and organizations, whatever it is, fighting for your attention. Where attention is the most valuable asset in the economy. And the reality is we are onslaughted every single day with whether it's what's on Netflix, what's on Twitter, what your friends are texting you, what notification your app gave you, blah, 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 right? And it's getting worse, not better in terms of the volume. But our ability as human beings, as a species, has not gotten better at, our ability to process information hasn't increased. We still process the same amount of things. We can still pay attention to the same amount of things we could before the internet, before social media. So what that means is that odds are no one's paying attention to anything you do. And number two, if they do pay attention, they'll probably forget about it pretty quickly. Like, caring is very, very rare in this attention economy. And we learned very quickly that we weren't just competing with the other 29 candidates, right? We weren't just competing with Liz Warren and Pete Buttigieg and Joe Biden, and you go down the list, or even John Delaney. We weren't just competing with them. We were competing with Kim Kardashian, whatever Taylor Swift had, whatever's on Netflix, whatever new HBO specials coming out, whatever is trending on Twitter that day. Like, go down the list. We were competing against all of it. So we didn't just have to be more interesting than Bernie Sanders. We had to be more interesting than where people are eating, where they're dining out, the Yelp reviews they're reviewing, whatever they're looking at on a day-to-day basis. And that is why you had to do a number of activities to stand out. So that's the attention economy, and we learned that the hard way, man. Like, we were ignored for so long. It was like part of our MO for about a year and a half.
How do you find the sweet spot between getting plenty of attention in that attention economy and still having the gravitas and being taken seriously as a credible candidate? Because a lot of the things that you have to do to get that attention sometimes get interpreted as, oh, well, he's not really serious. You know, he's crowd surfing.
That's the hardest part, right? Like, the stuff you do to get attention cuts the other way, right? Like, math, for example, like, helped us diffuse a number of bombs, right? There was the model minority nonsense he was getting thrown at by the press. He was kind of wonky in terms of some of his answers he was giving, right? So we made it a rallying cry, right? And made merch about it and leaned into it, which is awesome. And that helped us stand out and raise money and do a great thing, get crowds excited, all the things that you'd want from a long shot contender. But from a serious contender, math puts him in a certain lane, right? A lot of people don't like math class. Maybe that feels nerdy or cutting against the farther left supporters that maybe get offended by it. Like, you go down the list, right? And I talk a lot in the book about Bud Light marketing. And I had a friend that worked at Bud Light, so I learned some of it. Or she worked at, ran the Bud Light ad account. And you ask yourself, why does Bud Light advertise? And you're like, because we're so used to seeing Bud Light commercials, we never really don't ask ourselves that. Why does Bud Light advertise? Like, everyone knows what Bud Light is. Everybody. Like, if you're an adult over 18, probably over 15, you know what a Bud Light is. Is it because they want more people to know about Bud Light? Like, not really. Like, they're not introducing anything new. Is it because they have a new flavor or something? Sometimes, right? They got new seltzers or whatever they're doing, right? But the reason Bud Light advertises is to normalize Bud Light. And what do I mean by normalize? Like, it's so that when you go to a party or you go to a bar or wherever you're getting Bud Light and someone has a Bud Light or someone orders a Bud Light or you're drinking a Bud Light, it's not weird. It doesn't turn anyone's head. It's just like, oh, yeah, it's a party. Bud Light's here, of course. That's why they advertise. And there's plenty of companies that do this. And politics at the presidential level, but even at local level too, it becomes this way. Like, new outsider candidates are like, in the analogy I use in the book, is like Sweetwater 420 Pale Ale. Like, great beer, fantastic, tough to get, no one's heard of it. Like Bud Light dwarfs it. It's better than Bud Light in so many ways, almost every single category. But no one in like if you put a poll out, would you rather have Bud Light or Sweetwater? Like Bud Light's going to win by the money, by the feet, whatever you want to, how you want to measure that. It's because Bud Light is normal. It's safe. You don't feel like, in the politics way, you're not wasting your vote. You're not wasting your purchase. So there's a certain normalization that happens for presidential candidates in particular. And that comes mainly from our mainstream press, but it comes from the political establishment a bit and high-level donors, but it's mainly the press. If you're seeing Amy Klobuchar's name over and over and over and over, you must be like, hey, she's probably got a shot to win. That's a real option for me for president. If you never see Andrew's name, doesn't matter how awesome he is. You're like, well, he's not going to win. No one ever talks about him. He's not going to thing, right? And so that's the challenge. And now you may say, hey, well, Donald Trump did this. But don't forget, Donald Trump had 99.9% name recognition going into 2016 presidential. And it wasn't just like, I know Donald. He was a TV star in like the golden age of TV. In your home in prime time, being a boss, like being presidential in a way, right? And eventually the Republican establishment did line up behind him. And all the hate he got and all the media, they called it earned media, that normalized him. So that is something like you really need to get to win. And we were not going to get that. Just in the sole fact of really being new. You say Obama was new. Well, he was on the cover of Time before he ran for president, right? He was not as new as Andrew Yang, right? So anyway, I've rambled on that, but it's important. It's an important thing that is part of our presidential politics, at least up till now.
So tell me about when you heard or discussed with Andrew the decision to run for mayor. That came fast, man. I would have imagined he'd, take some time off.
So I think I mentioned this in the book. Is like when it comes to the mayor's race, I had what they call and what I would call from a DC perspective is the dream title. And if you're a DC consultant, you love this freaking title. And it was the title of senior advisor. And what does that mean? It means nothing. Like we would throw that title around to a whole bunch of people. And what it means is if we win, I can take all the credit, be like, I was a senior advisor to Andrew Yang, and he won. Or if we lose, I can say, well, I was just an advisor, like, it wasn't my fault. But that was my role in the mayor's race. My role on the mayor's race was, I helped set up the original team for sure, and then out the gate, and then it was basically some debate prep and Andrew's confidant, like I have in a lot of things, right? Because him and I, we do a ton of things together and have become good friends since, I took this job. But anyway, a lot of people forget the macro pictures before that mayor's race, or just in general. Like at the time when he entered that race, New York City, well, the whole country, frankly, had shut down. COVID was running wild. There were rumblings of a vaccine, but not really a vaccine in sight. Cash relief was the most popular policy in the country. And nationally, like 80+% approval. In New York City, it was like 89% approval. And New York City, people were fleeing in mass. And so there was a vibe and ethos of outsider. It's time to do something new. We need big ideas in a crisis. This is an opportunity to break this broken wheel of New York City politics. And who better than like the entrepreneur cash relief guy, who's an outsider, right? Fresh eyes, fresh perspective, big ideas, and his biggest idea is one we desperately need. So like by any of those macro metrics, if you're Andrew, you're like, this is a shot. I'm in a well positioned as any to enter this race. And it was his home. I think a lot of people don't realize that. Like he lived, the press chewed him out and loves to chew him out. And I guess me too at times. But he's from there. Like generally, he's been there 20 years. His
Mm-hmm.
wife was actually born there. He was born slightly like in Schenectady, I guess, but outside the city. But ended up coming here when he right out of college
Mm-hmm.
or in college for Columbia. You got your kids in school here. You've got your life here.
Yeah.
You go through this Iowa, New Hampshire presidential gauntlet, and you come home and New York's going to where. You're like, if I can help, I should. And you're talking about, wow, there's a chance to do universal basic income or massive cash relief
Mm-hmm.
programs in the biggest city in the world. Like you could be you could actually lead on policy and execution there. So it's seemingly the logic. I mean, you have to ask him for that, but I think, the fundamentals there were great. The problems are it's New York City politics, and then the fundamentals of the race changed because in April, almost half the country was vaccinated.
Yeah.
Like a month and a half into his race. So and then people come out of the woodwork. It becomes a crime race, and that's a different race. There's such a difference between a crime race and a cash relief race, and so that's a big part of it.
I know we talked a little bit about this in our last conversation when you were on the show, but I'm curious in further hindsight, one of the things on the presidential that I really wished happened was that he stayed in the race longer. That because, cash relief and the pandemic only became more and more prominent, after New Hampshire. And, in a way, you guys were like a startup. And sometimes the startups that just stay in it, it's a timing thing. You like when the timing lines up, that's just giving yourself more opportunity to kind of find your stride. Do you think that would have? I don't know if it would have changed the outcome, but I wonder if he would have gotten more opportunity to have a bigger voice in the Biden administration if he had been in it longer and gathered more steam.
So I'll tackle. There's kind of two questions there. One, should he have stayed in longer?
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me, I'll cut that over. Just kind of two questions there. I'll take them both. One is, should he have stayed in longer? And two, the Biden thing, which is separate. Because I think his opportunities with the Biden administration were, at that point, they were as good as they were going to be no matter what. And they were good for a bunch, and I'll talk about it. Staying in longer. To me, no, I don't think we should have stayed in longer, and I don't think it would have helped. I think that is something that sounds better in theory than it does in practice. Like everybody's like, well, in theory, if he had hung around and then COVID starts and then Andrew's like, oh, everybody's talking about cash relief. And theoretically, would he have bumped to the polls? Yeah, he would have had to have, right? Like cash relief, some of the best press we ever got was when COVID was running wild and Trump was talking about cash relief and all these, the Pope and Mitt Romney and Pelosi, they're all championing cash relief. But there's a couple things. That moment didn't happen for another 3 to probably 4 weeks, which is an eternity in presidential primaries. So that was 4 weeks after when that moment actually happened, when it happened pretty quickly. I remember I was in Mexico. I was trying to decompress and I was not able to. If you play it out, let's say he stays in after New Hampshire. Let's say we stay in. We go to Nevada and we get 0.03%, less than 1% and 0 delegates. And you stay in South Carolina and you perform even worse. And all along the way, you're either completely ignored or you're fringe or you're an afterthought. You're not qualifying for the debates. You're not getting any meaningful delegates for the convention. And you are, well, the problem was my biggest fear is that we'd end up back to fringe where we were at the beginning. And then when he dropped out, if he had dropped, like when either he dropped out or tried to make it to election day, both would have been awful. But when he had dropped out, then no one would have cared. It would have been an after, oh, that free money guy got crushed. But instead, on election night, when it's like massive political press, the world's paying attention, we were able to land the plane the way we wanted to. We got 4 awesome pieces in the Post, in the Times, in Politico, and in BuzzFeed, and we did them all at once, and then the other reporters followed suit. You had people from across the political aisle talking about the importance of Andrew Yang's movement. CNN said he put a dent in the universe. It was besides the cash relief moment, 5 or 6 or 4 or 5 weeks later, the best press we ever got. So that helped, I think, land the plane better and keep cash relief front of mind. And then don't forget, like, it's one of the reasons, like, Andrew Yang wasn't polarizing when cash relief needed to not be a polarizing topic. So I'd argue that helped a lot with getting cash relief to be a bipartisan issue. It helped us a lot in lobbying for cash relief shortly after that. So I don't think a world where we go to Nevada and get stomped again was good for the brand or Andrew or the movement or anything. As much as I would have liked it, we hung on and then there was cash relief. We would have been out of it by then. The press wasn't going to line up behind us regardless. So anyway, and then helping with Biden, like, he came out, I think he used to be a little more liked in the Democratic Party at the time. But we looked at working in the Biden administration. It's, no offense to my friends in D.C. Let's just say it's not the job for Andrew or me or anybody he had worked with closely. We would do these calls that talk to people about, what they did in, like, the Office of Science and Technology and other places. And, like, they talked to me like they were just, like, they talked to me like they were royal, like they did this amazing, awesome work. And they literally just wrote a big white paper. That was it. No one knew what the hell they did. So Andrew me personally, but Andrew would have hated that. And then he could have maybe pushed for, like, a big, like, fluff job, like Secretary of the Future that didn't mean anything, didn't have a budget, and just went around. And maybe that'd have been good for branding, but it's BS. Like, it's not, Andrew is, and that's not how he's wired, not how I'm wired. Like, he'd rather do something that everybody hates that he knows is right than do something that everyone thinks is a good idea that doesn't move the needle, So that's just how he's wired. I do respect that. He's better at that than I am, for sure.
And what about the decision to start a new political party? I mean, when you think about it, running for president, mayor of New York City, and starting a third party in, like, a 2-year period? I mean, that's like 3 lifetimes for some people.
Plus, he's got now 2 lobbying organizations, one for cash relief and one for Web3. I mean, look, and plus all the for-profit stuff. We're running this podcast, but that's not particularly for-profit. But there's a bunch of things we do on the side that are fun side hustles, or maybe full-time jobs for some people. It's a lot of work. Like, I'll say this: when he's healthy, because there were times at presidential he was sick, and so we had to drag him along. But when he's healthy, he's a force of nature. Like, he just won't stop. He'll just call me at 11 p.m. on a Friday, like on the weekend, just go. When's this done? Bump, and does not stop. He doesn't drink, doesn't really party, like, turns off every once in a while and just go. And like, anybody who's worked with him like that, he's kind of like that. He's very, like, let's do it. And it's like, hey, what do you think of this idea? He's like, great idea. Let me call him right now. Like, he's that type of guy. Just go. So it's not surprising to me. And then on the third party stuff, look, I'm trying to retire generally from politics. Andrew wants me to stop saying that. But I don't particularly love it. I think it's very judgmental, and I try not to be too judgmental. I don't like people judge me, and I don't like to judge others if I can avoid it. But that's what we do in politics. And you, like, make these impossible decisions about, should we get this endorsement? Like, that's yes or no. Like, some people hate you, some people love it. Will that work? Unclear. And so, but on the forward party, I like to think of it as, behind the scenes doing a lot of the blocking and tackling of democracy reform, like ranked choice voting and open primaries. That should be the core of it. And then, to me, it's less about forward party, which I think has a lot of upside. But if 2 or 3 other political parties are started because of it, and because of the work they're doing or the trail they set, I mean, what a legacy, right? To try to fix our duopoly and, like, mainstream cash relief. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. One of the things that you mentioned was the book was written partly for the Yang Gang, but also for people who are thinking of running for office. And yeah, I'd be curious, like, if you had to distill down a few things that advice you'd give to a first-time candidate? Like, what would be the key things that they should take away?
The book does a decent job of talking about how to brand somebody and how to create your message. And I talk about the concept of identity branding, which is different than a brand identity, which is basically what your logos and colors and slogans are. But identity branding is helping folks and your supporters identify with you or with your brand or with your candidate, seeing themselves in you, and then what techniques you can do to bring them along for the ride. So my advice for folks starting, like selfishly, I guess, would be read the book because I poured it all out there. But if you're not going to do that, lazies. I'm just kidding. I'm just totally kidding. I would say understand why you're running and why people should care. It's the biggest piece. Because you have to compete in the attention economy. And there's two ways to compete in the attention economy I was talking about. One is volume, which is what we're used to many times, where that's why Target emails you 100 times a day if you're on their email list, or it's why you see the same ad 50 times on TV, or why you see billboards over and over, or you see, if you join the Yang Gang email list, you probably got 100 emails asking you to donate, right? Like, it's because we're trying to beat you into submission, right? But you need money and resources to do that, right? So if you're a long shot candidate, you do not have money and resources, so you can't do volume. The second one is relevance. That's the other way to stand out in the attention economy is to be relevant to someone, personally relevant. So you're not the way you cut through the noise is because someone finds that what you're doing relevant. And the way for them to find what you're doing relevant is to have a personal identification, a personal connection with the candidate or the brand. They need to see themselves. So what's an example of that? It's like, if you ask 10 Democrats right now, Democratic voters, do you care about climate change? They all will say yes. But if you ask them to donate or show up to an event or sign a petition or things like that, the odds are they decrease every single time. The odds are they don't actually care. They kind of care, but they don't give a shit. And it's just like, and that's nothing wrong with that. It's just you and all of our lives. Like, you care. I care about LeBron James. I like watching him play basketball, right? But at the end of the day, I don't really give a shit, right? It's like you go down the list of there's things that you say you care, but we don't really care. There's a very few things you actually care about, and you can count them on a couple hands. And the key is to break through to that and find that. And the way to do that is to make people see themselves in you, because no one cares. I mean, the thing you care about most of the world, naturally, biologically, is yourself. So how do you create that personal connection? And we did it a lot with the Yang Gang, right? We didn't call it Andrew's Army. We called it Yang Gang. It was visceral. It was like, oh, I'm Yang Gang, like you felt that. We leaned into the math and the nerdiness where people were like, yeah, I like numbers, about time someone's doing math. Like, I identify with that, right? We let you guys, like, we had the progress bar where you could feel part of the progress. We're growing and growing. We had to get 65,000 donors on the debate stage, right? We're like, everybody give $1, get a friend to give $1. And people are like, I got my grandma, my sister, and blah, 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 right? Like, that was letting supporters along for the ride. So there's a long way I can break that down further in identity branding. There's kind of 3 steps to it. But the big thing was understand that why and how people are going to identify with you. Because if you can't answer it, you're going to lose. Like, because no one's going to understand it, right? The only way, look, it's hard for well-funded, established candidates to win without a powerful why and reason to run. Right? A lot of politicians now, their reason is because they've been a politician, and a lot of them stay in office that way. But for new guys and gals, you got to have your why.
So I guess one of the things about that approach is it seems like it would be very effective, but it also might create a very kind of niche candidate. As an example, with the math stuff, like, I definitely loved it and the PowerPoint and all that. But it feels like there's like a limited universe of people in the voting population who do identify with those things, and you'll get the 5%, but then it's hard to cross over. And at some point, you do need that kind of mainstream support, and they may not identify with the same things that got the first 5%.
This is the hardest part in identity branding in general. So I'll back up. So identity branding is talking about what it is. And basically you are you're creating this. There's three things. You're creating a like us mentality. So like
Mm-hmm.
us, if you're Apple, you're like us. You're chic. You're savvy. You're tech forward. You're cool, right? You've seen the ads
Mm-hmm.
that are I'm a PC, I'm a Mac, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
you literally creating someone to identify with in that. So like identity branding, like the big three pieces
Mm-hmm.
are, you got to have this like us mentality. So you got to create one. So you're creating a like us, like if you create a like us mentality, right? You're talking about, that's Apple saying like us, you're chic, you're tech savvy, you're forward thinking, right? You've seen the commercials where it's I'm a PC or I'm a
Mm-hmm.
Mac. Like they literally set someone up for people to identify with compared to old people, right? Who are like stuck in the old ways PCs. Or if you're Disney, you're like us, you're family oriented and whimsical and magical, right? And you feel that like us. And so Andrew was like us, we're solutions oriented, or an entrepreneur, or we love
Mm-hmm.
numbers, or we're out of the
Mm-hmm.
box, that sort of thing. The second one is to find your tribe. You got to go find or create your tribe, right? Who would identify with that human being?
Mm-hmm.
And then the third one is you have to let them in. You have to bring your supporters along for the ride. Those are the big three. And so to your point, those things can lead to gimmicky and niche and polarizing topics. And I write the last chapter is like the future of politics because of identity branding. The reality is this: the only way to contend in the attention economy is volume and relevance. So it's either going to be people with a lot of money and can beat you into submission with volume, like Mike Bloomberg style. Jeff Bezos could run, Elon Musk can run. If you have hundreds of millions of dollars, you can contend without being a crazy identity branded person. Or those who understand this game and make themselves relevant. And what are they going to do to make themselves relevant? We're seeing it now, where they take one polarizing issue, they make it part of their identity. So when people think, I hate critical race theory, they think Marjorie Taylor Greene, or they think whoever is going to, they think gun rights, they're going to be Lauren Boebert or wherever. These people are awful. But they master this. They understand it. Like I don't know if you saw the State of the Union. They were awful. I spent a lot of time with Andrew shitting on the left, and I'm trying to do a better job of I also don't like the far right, I just want to say. But they understand identity branding really well. They understand who they are, and they bring their supporters along for the ride. And pros and cons to this, right? Pro, anybody can now contend at any office. Very cool. Completely democratic. You're like Matthew Gaetz is a national name. Like Rob DeSantis, like just a kind of a nerdy governor in Florida, like hammers the press on mask mandates or XYZ, like makes a national story about himself, right? And you see on the left too. AOC is a small congresswoman from the Bronx, the squad in general, but there are others that I think are a little more, little less polarizing, like Katie Porter or Ro Khanna or some folks that have made decent identity brands on issues they care about, right? I think so. So the pros, a lot more people running for office, a lot more excitement. People are going around the establishment, donors and press and political powers that be. This is cool. These are cool things. Theoretically good for democracy. What are the cons? If you run for office, if you have an identity brand, it's very tough to compromise. Very tough. Think about it. If you're Bernie Sanders, what's your identity brand? Essentially, Medicare for all. The progressive left, and essentially, Medicare for all. Now, Bernie, I think, feels this in his bones. But if you're someone who's identified as a Medicare for all candidate, realistically, if I say to you, look, we can't get you Medicare for all, but I can get you Medicare for 80% of people. I can get you Medicare for 90% of people. I can get you 95%. Realistically, you would rather have any percentage over zero, which is kind of what we have now, right? You'd rather have some growth. But if your identity brand is Medicare for all and not Medicare for some, you can't compromise there. So you're just stuck and you can't get anything done. And then so that's the biggest one. It's very difficult to compromise, and you end up just like with ideologues, and not compromising, by the way, raises you more money, gets you more press, gets you more supporters, makes your rally bigger because people love raging against the machine, whatever it is, right? So that's number one. And then number two, you're more susceptible to shifting political winds. So, because if your identity is in this lane and the world goes this way, it's tough to merge them back. And like Andrew lived this, like I talked about on the mayor race, big time, because it was a big cash relief race, and then it became a public safety race. And when you're not a government official, you are behind the 8 ball if you're an outsider on public safety, particularly as a Democrat. But ignore that. I mean, Donald Trump lived this in 2020. Like, the economy was good. Like, it wasn't like a shoo-in for the Dems to take the White House back at all. He was winning pretty much every poll against every candidate, besides Andrew, actually. And Biden was close. But, he's close, but the polls are generally wrong, and were very wrong on election night. Like, they were like Pennsylvania, he was supposed to win by 4 points. I think he lost or was close to losing. He barely won, sorry. Anyway, like, Trump gets a lot of people who are not traditionally polled, so the polls need to be pretty heavy. But the bigger point was that Trump was identity branded. He had an identity brand of draining the swamp, anti-establishment, building the fucking wall. I am the proverbial brick in the wall. I'm going to blow this whole thing up, right? I'm anti-establishment, anti-big government. And when COVID hits, what are we all craving for? Strong government leadership. Absolutely. He's the wrong guy for the moment. Joe Biden is the establishment. He literally ran on nostalgia. Restore the soul of America. He said, imagine me with Obama. That's what we can bring it back to. And not a great message if, COVID isn't going on, right? If Washington is ineffective. But if you need a nation scale government response, he's a very compelling candidate, So those are the big challenges. To answer your question, I don't know. I just know I just played the cards we were dealt. Like, get this guy on the debate stage and take a shot, and that was the best play we could do.
Yeah, you certainly punched above your weight class and got way further than anybody would have expected. So congrats on that.
Well, thank you. And honestly, man, thanks to Yang Gang, right? Like, you guys saw what I saw and hopped on, right? And look, like in the book, I talk about this. Like, we did gimmicks. We went on the debate stage and we gave away money, guys. Like, we blew it up. And it worked from a, like, relevancy situation. We became really popular. We raised a ton of money. We got a bunch of emails. After then, we were the most, like, he's still famous, mainly because of that, right? That's what he popularized the movement, because of that. But there's downsides to that. Like, it normalized a bit, but that was a lane he put himself in. Now, I believe very strongly that if he hadn't done that, we'd probably fade out after the third debate, because you're still the free money guy that isn't as lovable, and you have so many strong contenders on that debate stage, like, you're not really sticking out. But we leaned in and we owned it, right? And that cut through, and it was more authentic than most of the candidates on there. That's why it did well. So we thought we could pivot and evolve our platform, because we had 4 or 5 months after that debate. That's an attorney in politics, but we needed more institutional support. Here we are.
Last question. In the book, you talk about the Yang Gang and how you weren't an Andrew Yang supporter. You were joining the Yang Gang, and I'm curious about, like, it's there's still folks who identify with the Yang Gang out there, but it's kind of lost a little steam, and I don't feel like Andrew's really encouraged it to keep going. I'm curious, like, has the Yang Gang, like, is that a chapter in the history?
It died?
It's
a great question. I think, in general, it's tough to keep a movement like that going if you're not running for office, right? And then if you're not holding elected office, it's tough to keep that going as well. Like, Bernie was able to do it a bit because he was in office for 4 years, right? As he had been. Like, nothing had particularly changed. But Andrew wasn't an elected official after that race, right? What do you do next, right? And then the other analogy is, like, there's Donald Trump himself, but there's Trumpism. And Andrew, we were just talking about this the other day. Is like Donald Trump will fade out over time, of course, but Trumpism will probably live on. And so, to answer your question, like, look, I think Andrew is now at a point where he's relatively famous, a very good problem solver, pretty good entrepreneur, right? And can wield his influence to open certain doors and start things, right? And solve certain problems. And you're seeing that in the lobbying side a bit and other things we do. I think like encouraging the Yang Gang in its like in terms of that visceral identity love for Andrew, it's like at a certain point would get selfish, especially if you're not running for office. And I do think it's important that these ideas live on and not just Andrew, right? Like, so I think, and I know there's a lot of, I've learned a lot about the importance of the message and the messenger and how they can be very, very tied. But I think cash relief is far bigger than Andrew now. Universal basic income is far bigger than Andrew, in a good way. So I don't think the Yang Gang's dead, but I think the rallying cry will probably be placed elsewhere. And I've seen it. Like, honestly, I've seen it a lot in Web3. I was very surprised at how many Yang Gang members are into crypto because it gets a bad rap, which most good things do, oddly, and sadly. But it's a very wholesome, optimistic environment that Web3 and crypto are building. I'm just getting into just learning, but it felt there were a lot of Andrew Yang fans there because a lot of them are apolitical and entrepreneurs and mindset of abundance and things like that. So I don't mean to depress anybody. If you walk down the street and say Yang Gang and you see me, I will absolutely yell back. But yeah, it's not about Andrew anymore in this environment, nor should it be. And I'm proud of that. It should be bigger than that. And it should take shape in various ways, the rest of my lifetime and yours too,
What's next for Zach? What are you going to be focusing on, man?
So I'm writing this. So I'm gonna do like a version of a book tour, stuff like this, I guess, which feels I like to sell stuff, but I do not like to sell myself. That's very uncomfortable for me to like this book is even still about Andrew and politics and not about Zach, which they made me write a chapter about my childhood and things like that, which I hated. It's awful. You guys don't give a shit. I'm going to, honestly, I'm going to get back into entrepreneurship. We got a couple big ideas we're working on. And then I like the podcast. I don't think I love media. You in media too long, you say infinity things, and you're eventually going to say something stupid. I already do say things stupid all the time. But I'd like to get back into entrepreneurship. So I got a couple things in the irons of fire will come out. And then ideally, this book can help. My dream for a long shot is for it to, what people who read it can think same way I did, which was I was ridiculous in thinking it, but I want to make it less ridiculous for people to read it and say, oh, I could run for office like that, or I could do that. That's not too Herculean. The odds are not too far stacked against me. And use it for good. That's my dream. If there's a bunch of people using identity branding to compete in the attention economy and doing it for good, I think that's a very good thing. I think only good will come from that. So that's what's next, man.
Yeah. Well, hopefully people will take advantage of the book.
I'm working on the economics of the book right now. It's a bit of a bear. Book economics, not great. They're really great if you are Barack Obama, right?
Yeah, I heard.
You sell, or if it's like your seventh book, or you have you have book fans. That's the thing. Book marketing is so different than any other type of marketing because it's a certain type of person and it's a big commitment. So you gotta be good. So we'll find out. We'll see if the book community likes my book. I just hope I wrote it for the Yang Gang. I wrote it and anyone who wants to run for office ever. So I hope y'all enjoy it, find it fun, and remember what we were a part of because we made history for better or for worse, right? And no matter, say what you want about me, my decisions, or Andrew, or anything, you cannot deny we had an impact on history, which is cool. It's really exciting.
I love the book, and if you supported Andrew Yang during the presidential and you wanted a little like making of that campaign kind of documentary, that's what it felt like. And there were a lot of details and anecdotes that I didn't know about that I thought were super interesting. So highly recommend it.
Thank you, man. That's a big thing about what I've learned is that anytime I criticize sports teams and things like that, well, you realize having doing this, like no one has, if you're from the outside looking in, you have no idea what's going on behind the scenes.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully it's a little bit of a sneak peek of like what actually was
Absolutely.
happening. But even
Behind
then, I
the
can't write
curtain.
everything, right? So
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on, Zach.
thank you, Tom. Thank you, nerds. Thank you, guys.
With that, we'll say goodbye, nerds.
Goodbye, nerds. Much
Love it.
love.